The United States Supreme Court is allowing the Trump administration to enforce the latest version of the president's travel ban. This means President Trump will now be able to stop people from 6 mostly Muslim countries from entering the United States, even if they have ties to the U.S. Attorney Seth Berensweig joins me on the phone now. Hi, Seth. Were you surprised by either the decision or the number of justices who voted to support Trump's ban? Seth, are you with me? Can you hear me? All right, I think we may be having some audio difficulties.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Seth, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thanks for being with us. First off, were you surprised by the Supreme Court's decision here?
Well, I was a bit surprised because it's unusual for the Supreme Court to chime in when the lower courts, the federal panel courts, are really only a couple of weeks away from issuing a ruling. So from that sense, the timing is unusual. But the Supreme Court generally has a tendency of not supporting preliminary injunctions in lower case matters. And what's really happening here, I think that the way to really boil this down is that this is a short-term procedural snafu without really changing the long-term substance. Basically what's happening is that this is quibbling over how long this case will go on whether the administration can enforce its travel ban until there's a final decision on the merits. What the Supreme Court said today is we're going to give the administration a win, but it's only a short-term win. For the next few short weeks, they can enforce a complete and total ban of anyone coming in from these 6 largely Muslim countries, but that still doesn't change the substance in the big picture. The Fourth Circuit Appellate Court on the East Coast and the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court on the West Coast is going to be hearing the final oral arguments on these cases within the next couple of days. There will be rulings coming down on a final ruling probably before Christmas, and I still think the administration has a big uphill battle when it comes to the merits on this case.
But what message does this send to those groups that are fighting this ban in the lower courts?
Well, it sends a message that the Supreme Court has signaled that they may have a problem if it gets appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I don't think that it's something that they should be completely disheartened about because they really have to take the case one step at a time. After all, I think that the case against the travel ban, you could argue, has become strengthened even in the last couple of days. The basic argument through the cases that are stemming through Hawaii and Maryland is whether the Trump administration committed religious discrimination illegally with regard to this ban or whether it was a proper exercise of immigration laws. Even just a couple of days ago, the president ensnared himself in further controversy by retweeting an extreme, arguably anti-Muslim series of videos, which I'm sure will be coming up. So ultimately, these appellate courts will be making a decision. It'll be done by the end of this month. It'll be a close call, but I do think that the administration still has a problem on the discrimination claims.
But does this suggest that if the High Court does hear this case, that it will support this latest version of the ban?
Well, I agree with you that the Supreme Court will ultimately hear this case. I believe what will probably happen is that the 2 appellate courts are going to rule against the administration. They've already demonstrated that they're strongly inclined to do that. Then the government will appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will hear this case next year. Yes, the Supreme Court has indicated that they have a propensity to try to support the president on this, but by no means is that going to be a slam dunk because it's still going to be a close call to determine whether the government can demonstrate that this has nothing to do with religious animus. So this is a battle that will be ongoing for probably the next few months.
Were you surprised that only 2 justices voted against supporting the ban at this point?
Probably not, because keep in mind that we now have Justice Gorsuch, who was installed in the Supreme Court not long ago, and now the conservative majority is more clearly back in step, and that has been filled in the Supreme Court. But I can guarantee you that this will end up in a Supreme Court showdown. This is going to call into question whether the president has violated his inherent constitutional and immigration-based authority to make these decisions. It's unusual for circuit courts to rule against the president because the case law is very very favorable in supporting the president's general actions, but this is something that is really going to be a close call as the cases flow through the most powerful federal courts in the United States.
Seth Berensweg, thank you for that.
My pleasure.